So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's virtual presentation, Politics in Print Presidential Campaigns from Early America with Tom Keefe. My name is Patrick Stenshorn. I am the Director of Interpretive Programs at the Albany Institute. Tonight, I am joined on the call by my colleague, Victoria Waldron, who is the museum's education assistant. She is on the call under the name Albany Institute of History and Art Education. If you should have any technical issues during tonight's presentation, please feel free to contact Victoria and she will help you troubleshoot any issues that you might be having. For tonight's presentation, please double check to make sure that your microphone is on mute. If you are using a device that has a webcam on it, please feel free to have your webcam turned on or off, whatever is most comfortable for you. We will conduct a question and answer session at the end of today's presentation using the chat function here on Zoom. If you have a question for Mr. Keefe, please feel free to type it into the chat box and I will then read all questions at the conclusion of the program. This evening's lecture will be presented by our guest speaker, Tom Keefe. Mr. Keefe is a political items collector as well as a national authority on campaign buttons and memorabilia. He is also a volunteer in the library at the Albany Institute, where he has been working to catalog the Dewitt Clinton Broadside collection. Several of those broadsides from that collection will be featured in tonight's program. So please join me in welcoming Tom Keefe.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. Before I start talking about what we're going to see on the screen, the broadsides we're going to see on the screen, I just want to mention to you that are in the vicinity of Albany or have the opportunity to be in the vicinity of Albany, if you haven't yet come to the Albany Institute of History and Art to see its wonderful presentations in general, but right now the program, the temporary program that's up, that's titled Fellow Citizens, Dewitt Clinton's Broadsides of the Early Republic, will continue through May 16th, and it is just a must-see exhibit. Tonight, I'll be discussing several of the broadsides from the Dewitt Clinton Broadside collection that's owned by the Institute and has been owned, they have owned this collection for over 150 years. Last month, I gave a talk, and that talk focused on the broadsides from the collection having to do with the Revolutionary War. Tonight, the focus is going to be on broadsides from the collection that have to do with the President of the United States. Now, most of these that we're going to talk about tonight are related to the campaign, a presidential campaign. A few are not specifically campaign related, but they are related to the president. Last month, I spoke at length about the history of the Dewitt Clinton collection. I'm not going to repeat that whole portion of the story. It's a very interesting story. And if you didn't participate last month, if you want to see that talk, it's on the Institute's website. And I think this talk will be on the Institute's website in the future as well. I am going to, however, give a synopsis of what the collection is all about and broadsides in general. A broadside is essentially a poster that has been made on a printing press. Sometime after the invention of the printing press in the 1400s, the printing of one-sided single sheets, that became known as broadsides developed and flourished. Early examples were ballads and poetry. It also became a popular form for proclamations. These were printed on cheap paper and made for temporary posting. These were not meant to last very long. Increasingly, they were used for advertising and public announcements by governments, organizations, individuals, and businesses. In England in the 18th century, the use of broadsides at public executions became prevalent. Printers published ghastly texts and often inserted woodcut images, and then they sold those broadsides to the people attending the execution. Harvard Law School Library has a digitalized collection of more than 500 crime and execution broadsides that span from 1707 to 1891. In England, political controversies resulted in various factions producing broadsides. In the American colonies, the political conflicts with England led to the production of broadsides addressing those conflicts. It has generally been believed by scholars as well as collectors of American political campaign material that broadsides became popular in use for political campaigns in the mid-1820s into the 1830s as the electoral franchise liberalization brought millions of citizens into the voting system. In the early days of the United States, very small minority of citizens had the right to vote. Estimates are that no more than 4% to 7% of the population. With few eligible voters, candidates and factions had no particular need to produce things like broadsides to reach out and capture the attention of voters. Now, that belief that broadsides in America were not used in campaigns till mid-1824 ended in 2016 when I was invited by Jack McEnany and the Institute staff to take a look at several Aaron Burr broadsides that were to be used in the Alexander Hamilton exhibit that was up at that time. And I was therefore introduced to the Dewitt Clinton broadside collection. Before 2016, the nature and contents of this collection were generally unknown to scholars and collectors. It consists of 108 broadsides dating from 1775 to 1813. 58 are directly related to an election, including elections for New York governors, lieutenant governors, congressmen, state legislators, city council members, and presidents of the United States. In this period, most offices, such as mayors and sheriffs and judges, even United States senators, district attorneys, and attorney generals, were appointed positions. They weren't elected positions. 27 of the broadsides in the collection are on political subjects, but they don't relate directly to an election. Now, this discovery revolutionized the understanding of pre-1824 American political campaigns. Now, Dewitt Clinton had become active in politics very young, at the age of 20. He started his career in a very high-level position in 1790 as the secretary to his uncle, Governor George Clinton, who had first been elected governor in 1777. DeWitt served as secretary until his uncle left the governorship in 1795. DeWitt then became the leader of the anti-governor John Jay Clintonian faction in the state, and in 1798, he became its legislative leader, including being appointed to the powerful four-member Council of Appointment. He was appointed United States Senator in 1802. He served for 2 years, and then he was appointed mayor of the city of New York, where he served most of the period through 1815. Simultaneously to being mayor of New York, he was a lieutenant governor in 1811 and 1812. And also in 1812, DeWitt Clinton ran for president of the United States against James Madison. Now, there's some mystery about the broadside collection. Primarily, what was its purpose and why did DeWitt accumulate and save them? One thing that's certainly not, that is very clear, is that Dewitt Clinton was not a collector of political campaign material like I and thousands of others collect political campaign material. The modern concept of collecting things did not really begin to flourish until the late 19th century. It's likely that his political leadership activity was the reason for the collection. It's a mystery why the accumulation ends at 1813, because Dewitt's political leadership continued another 15 years until his sudden death in 1828. After a bit, also it's unclear as to how the collection ended up with the Albany Institute. It came from Albany Dr. Roman Beck, a longtime board member and friend of the Albany Institute. His gift to the Institute was made before his death in 1855. Now, Beck's possession is likely related to his promise to the Clinton family that he would write the biography of Dewitt Clinton. There's no information about what, if anything, the Institute did with this collection until it was rediscovered in 1911 in a closet in the Institute. At that time, it was bound in a large volume where each broadside was sewn onto a page of the volume. A label on that volume said it was a gift of Beck. At some unknown point, probably in the 1960s or 70s, the broadsides were removed from the volume and professionally conserved and they are now kept in individual plastic sheets, easily accessible in a very safe storage at the Institute. Upon the 2016 revelation to the history scholar and collector community, word spread fast, and it is now widely recognized that political campaign broadsides were used at least starting after the 1787 enactment of the US Constitution. Research has revealed similar broadsides in private collections and institutions throughout the United States and even all over the world. But the staggering number of pre-1820 political broadsides in the Institute's collections are illustrated by the fact that the known number of pre-1820 political campaign broadsides in the world outside of the Institute is smaller than the number of the political campaign broadsides in the Institute. Now, tonight, again, I'm focusing on things about presidents. And the first item for us to look at is titled Fellow Citizens. It's dated April 30th, 1789. It's signed anonymously by a Federalist. Now, the purpose of this broadside was it is urging voters to defeat George Clinton running for re-election and vote for Judge Robert Yates, the Federalist candidate. Now, why am I talking about a gubernatorial broadside if I'm featuring the President of the United States? Well, the Constitution was enacted in 1787 after a bitter, contentious battle that left lasting scars, and it was extremely politically emotional, and it was the precursor to the slow creation of formal political parties. The pro-Constitution forces were known as Federalists, and the anti-Constitution forces, anti-Federalists, and they became Republican Democrats. Due to the enactment of the Constitution, the first election was 1788 for the House of Representatives. Now, remember, United States senators were not elected at that time. They were appointed by state legislatures. And there was also no real presidential election in 1788, as few of the 11 states conducting elections gave their citizens any version of a direct vote for presidential electors. And no person actively sought the presidency. Two states had actually not ratified the Constitution, so two states didn't even choose congressmen. And in New York State, the largest state, the legislature was unable to agree on electors, so New York State actually didn't participate that year in the Electoral College. Now, it was generally believed at the time that the office of president was going to be bestowed on Washington unless he refused to leave retirement. And so in that first presidential election, just like in the next four presidential elections, they didn't vote for the Electoral College didn't vote for president and vice president separately. all electors had 2 ballots, and they posted those ballots at the same time. The person who had the most votes was president, and the person with the second most votes was vice president. So in that first election, there were 69 electors. Washington received 69 votes. Adams received 34 votes. Now, both houses of Congress convened for the first time on March 4th, 1789. That was the date the original Constitution provided for the inauguration of the president. Neither body had a quorum. The Electoral College presidential vote could not be certified by Congress because a large mob attacked the Capitol and took it. Oh, no, wait, I'm mixing up my elections. I apologize. I'm mixing up my elections. They weren't able to certify the Electoral College vote because they didn't have a quorum. The House didn't achieve a quorum until April 1st, and the Senate didn't achieve a quorum until April 6th. Once they established the quorums and they certified the electoral vote, both houses then chose members to escort Washington to New York. Washington left Mount Vernon on April 17th. He traveled to Alexandria and Baltimore and Wilmington and Philadelphia and Trenton. All along the way, met by massive crowds, and at every place they had celebrations. On the morning of April 23rd, he and the escorts traveled by barge from Trenton to New York City, and he arrived late in the day and was then entertained at the home of his old friend, Governor George Clinton. And I have not been able to find out why they then delayed for 7 more days, but the inauguration was scheduled for noon on April 30th at Federal Hall in downtown New York. That day happened to be election day in the state of New York. This first broadside that we're looking at was printed on the day of the inauguration, and it actually describes the inauguration. Quote, "You have this moment been witness to one of the noblest spectacles that the eyes of free men ever beheld. You have seen the first patriot of this country raised by unanimous voice of his fellow citizens to the highest station in it, standing in the august presence of the people and binding himself by a solemn oath to support the Constitution established by their deliberate and voluntary consent," end quote. The broadside then states, quote, "You owe it to yourselves and to the rest of the United States to remove as dependents every source of embarrassment which may threaten the successful administration of the government which you have concurred in establishing. It urges those who have not yet voted to go to the polls of the several wards to which you reside and remove George Clinton as governor, the greatest enemy of the Constitution, and elect Judge Yates." George Clinton had just stood next to George Washington on the podium as Washington was sworn into office. Now, other than newspaper reports about the first inauguration, I believe that this broadside is the only physical item in existence that was created and is relating to the actual event of the inauguration of George Washington for the first time as President of the United States. This is a remarkably historic broadside. The next 2 broadsides are actually borrowed from the Albany Institute's collection of broadsides and posters. It's not part of the Dewitt Clinton collection. The first of the next ones is from January 7th, 1800. It is printed in Albany, and it sets forth the order of procession for the Albany observance of the mourning of the death of George Washington. The ceremony is presided over by Philip Van Rensselaer, who is the brother of the patroon and at the time was mayor of the city of Albany. The progression begins at the corner of Watervliet and Orange Streets and proceeds downtown Albany to the North Church on North Pearl Street and Orange Street, that beautiful church that's still there today. The church was designed by Philip Hooker, and it only opened 2 years before this event. Now notice the spelling of procession in the title of this broadside, where the spelling is spelled with 2 F's instead of S's, and that is very, very common use of the letter F in the broadsides of this area. There's a great list of attendees: the governor, the lieutenant governor, the members of the Council of Appointment, the judges of the state. Now, Washington died suddenly on December 14th, 1799. Word of his death spread slowly and over days and weeks and months. Now, many people involved in this program tonight, if you were alive and over 8, you remember, like it was yesterday, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Think of what it was like in early 1800 when word slowly spread that Washington was dead. He was only 67 years old. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson would live for another 26 more years. There was widespread grief. The nation was in universal mourning over the death of Washington, the father of our country. Virtually every community in America had similar local events months after Washington's death. This next broadside is dated February 22nd, 1800, Washington's first birthday after he died. It's the order of the divine service at the North Church in honor of Washington's birthday. With his death, the annual celebration of Washington's birthday became widespread. In 1832, Congress created a joint committee to plan the national celebration of Washington's 100th birthday. That committee was chaired by Henry Clay. The federal holiday naming Washington's birthday as a national holiday by an act of Congress was in 1879. This broadside is the earliest example of a birthday celebration for George Washington that's in existence. Our fourth broadside, our next broadside, is printed on April 1st, 1800, and it states right in its title, which is kind of hard to see, quote, "Thoughts on the subject of the ensuing election," end quote. It begins with mourning the death of Washington less than 4 months before its printing. It states, quote, "Before you adopt the nomination of a single candidate, compare his principles, private and public, with those of a Washington. Is he attached to liberty, the rights of man, and Republican government?" End quote. And then it goes on to attack President John Adams, stating that Adams believes that the British Constitution of King and Lords and Commons is the most stupendous effort of human understanding. It calls for the rejection of Adams' re-election. It challenges the creation of a standing army, which it states was against the wishes of Washington. It goes on to attack Adams for increasing the national debt by more than $19 million, and that his budget spent $5 million more than revenue, and that difference had to be borrowed at 8%. It states that Adams had been in public service for 22 years, earning more than $240,000. And it says, quote, "If then there be anything found in the doctrine of rotation in office, as it tends to equalize pretensions as well as benefits, surely it is time for Mr. Adams to retire." So I want to focus on the fact that this is an extremely strange phenomena, with this broadside making a scathing public attack on the sitting president of the United States in the midst of a presidential re-election campaign. This had never happened before here in America, or I think anywhere else. This democracy thing was an experiment. Never before in history in the world had a national leader been voted out of office where that leader accepted defeat as opposed to just declaring fraud and staying in power. But remarkably, just less than a year after the death of Washington, President John Adams was defeated by Vice President Thomas Jefferson, and Adams peacefully left office. This was the real American Revolution. Today, throughout the world, no nation can truly claim to be a democracy until they have experienced a leader losing re-election and stepping aside. Our next broadside, is addressed to the electors of the state of New York, and it's printed anonymously in Albany on April 4th. This is very lengthy and deals with many subjects taken up by the just completed New York State legislative session. The first and most important is legislation that was defeated, which would have transferred the power of selecting presidential electors from the state legislature to a direct vote by the voters. The legislation was proposed by Jefferson partisans. Jefferson forces believed they had better chance to receive New York's electoral votes if the voters choose rather than the legislators. Federalists controlled the legislature, and the bill was unlikely to be enacted because the Adams forces also believed that things would be in their best interest to keep the status quo. It turned out to make no difference because in this election, in the 1800 election, the Democratic Republicans won a large majority of the state legislative seats, and Jefferson won New York's 12 electoral votes, and he thereby beat Adams in the Electoral College by 8 votes. It is interesting that having taken over the state legislature, the Republicans no longer were interested in giving up their power and transferring it to the voters. The change in how electoral college members were chosen did not go to the people for another 28 years. The next broadside is from March 4th, 1801. It is Inauguration Day, and it's titled American Roast Beef, a song composed for the March 4th, 1801. This broadside praises Jefferson's triumph over Adams. It refers to the issue of Adams creating a standing army and a navy and predicts, quote, good men in office, bad men out, end quote. It assures that in the future, if ambitious men attempt to enslave the nation with, quote, despotic laws, freemen will oppose them or die in the cause. Now, Jefferson is, and it states, Jefferson is the man that can be trusted and freemen will crush faction and party. This song is a takeoff of a popular British song titled The Roast Beef of Old England. It's an instrumental ballad written by Henry Fielding for his play The Grub Street, which was first performed in 1731. The lyrics were added over the next 20 years, and the song increased in popularity when it was given a new setting by composer Richard Levowich, and it became customary for theater audiences to sing it before, after, and sometimes even during the production of new plays. The Royal Navy always goes to dine at mess to the tune. Now, I'm sure we all know the words to this song, so how about we all sing it together? The next broadside is also borrowed from the Institute's broadside and poster collection. It's dated June 1812 and printed in Albany. It indicates at the very top that it's the 8th edition. Now, there are several other copies of this 8th edition printing that are known to exist, but no earlier editions have surfaced or are known. It's titled The First Great Western Empire, or the United States of America. It is a large bold, impressive broadside illustrated with emblems of the United States composed chiefly of typographic elements. It's a large central framework includes at the upper left the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, and at the upper right an excerpt from George Washington's farewell address, extolling, quote, the unity of government and people, end quote. And it incorporates a small temple of freedom surmounted by a small liberty figure and contains the words of the federal Constitution. On each side are oval busts, portraits of presidents, left to right, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and incumbent Madison, who is in the midst of running for re-election. Under these busts is written, quote, these are the men who, with thousands of others, achieved the independence of the United States. They laid the foundations of our freedom broad and deep. They constructed her temple of the choicest materials of past ages and embellished it with the finest ornaments of modern times. Should this vast fabric be left to decay or be rent asunder, then the fairest hopes of the friends of freedom throughout the world will be forever lost, end quote. Above them are small vignettes representing, on the left, agriculture and domestic manufacturers, and the quote, the immovable pillars of the independence of our country, end quote. And on the right, commerce, quote, a strong support to our national edifice, end quote. In the upper section of the framework are the seal of the United States and a listing of the names of the 17 states with their 1810 census figures. There are various quotation and brief texts are included, the longest of which are an account of George Washington's resignation of his commission and a description of the geography, government, and people of the United States. And then there is the song Columbia, written by Dr. Dwight, president of Yale College. The contents of this broadside warn other nations not to interfere in American commerce and affirms the power of, quote, the first great Western empire or the United States of America, end quote. Writing in the upper left circle reads, quote, we wish for the friendship of all, we will submit to the insults of none, end quote. And in the upper right circle, quote, the ocean is the highway of nations, heaven alone has the right to command it, end quote. Now, there's nothing in this broadside that refers to the impending election, but it certainly seems to me to be a very political broadside. At this time, many Democratic Republicans in the northern states were unhappy over the perceived dominance of the presidency by the state of Virginia. 3 of our 4 presidents had been Virginians, and these northern forces wanted to nominate one of their own rather than renominate Madison. Initially, their hopes looked towards Vice President George Clinton, who had actually challenged Madison for the presidential nomination in 1808. But his poor health and advanced age, he was 72, eliminated its chances. You certainly can't have a person run for president at 72. Even before George Clinton's death in April of 1812, his nephew Dewitt Clinton was considered the preferred candidate to move against Madison by the Northern Democratic Republicans. Hoping to forestall a serious movement against the incumbent president and a division within the Democratic Republican Party, some proposed making Dewitt Clinton the nominee for vice president. Dewitt was not opposed to the offer, but he preferred to wait until after the conclusion of the New York caucus, which would not be held until after the congressional caucus had met to finalize its decision. Early caucuses were held in the states of Virginia and Pennsylvania, and both of those states pledged support to Madison. On May 18th, a Democratic Republican congressional nominating caucus was held, and Madison was nominated, although the divisions were quite apparent. Only 86 of the 134 Democratic Republican senators and congressmen participated in the caucus. Seeking a northerner for a running mate, the caucus chose Governor of New Hampshire, John Langdon, who declined due to his advanced age. He was 70. And they then went to Governor Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts and nominated him for vice president, even though he wasn't much younger. He was 68. Now, you all know Governor Gerry, right? He's known as the father of gerrymandering, based on his creation of partisan districts in Massachusetts that were said to look like mythical salamanders. When the New York caucus met on May 29th, it was dominated by anti-war Democratic Republicans, and it nominated Dewitt Clinton for president almost unanimously. After the United States declared war against Britain in June of 1812, Clinton sought to create a coalition of anti-war Democratic Republicans and Federalists. With Clinton in the race, the Federalist Party declined to formally put forth a nominee, hoping that its members would vote for Clinton. But they did not formally endorse him because they were afraid that that explicit endorsement would hurt their other candidates for other offices. So despite Clinton's success in getting Federalist support, Madison was reelected, having gotten 50.4% of the popular vote to DeWitt Clinton's 47.6%, making the 1812 election the closest election up to that point in popular vote. Madison won a relatively comfortable victory in the Electoral College, 128 to 89. This was the most closely contested election between 1800 and 1824. This broadside, published at the time when the special session of Congress called by President Madison to consider war against Great Britain, was meeting. Nothing in it refers to the impending election, but it is hard not to see this as a pro-Madison political broadside. Okay, next we have a broadside printed in Pennsylvania, and it addresses the people of York County. It's not dated, but it announces a peace meeting to be held in York on September 4th, 1812. So clearly it was printed prior to September 4th, 1812, and most likely no more than several weeks prior. We're not moving to the next broadside yet, but I'll just mention that the next broadside we are going to address is actually a broadside that is reporting on the results of that September 4th meeting that is advertised in this broadside. This broadside, in its text, criticizes the 1812 congressional session and the laws enacted in that session, which included a standing army, and it included the calling up of 50,000 volunteers for military service, and it called for the calling up of 100,000 militia members from the various states. The legislative session borrowed $11 million, and it issued $5 million in paper money. It doubled duties on all imports, and its appropriations were $20 million for 1 year of expenses. It also declared war on Britain. The broadside states that we may see, quote, the destruction of our seaports, the invasion of our country, the loss of our liberty, end quote. It then goes on that this can only be avoided by a change of men at the next election. And it calls for the election of a president, members of Congress, and members of state legislators who are, quote, friends of peace and friends of free trade, end quote. So this is a very political broadside, but it does not mention Madison. It does not mention any other candidates, but it is clearly calling for Madison's defeat. Now, our next broadside, which I mentioned a moment ago, is also a Pennsylvania broadside, and it is reporting in what had been billed as a peace meeting. But interestingly, nothing in this broadside refers to the meeting as a peace meeting. Instead, the broadside starts off by saying that it was a meeting of a large number of electors, a large number of voters from the area of York County. They got together and they expressly endorsed the election of Dewitt Clinton for president. This meeting was held in the county courthouse in York, Pennsylvania. This building they met in was the same building where the Second Continental Congress had enacted the original Articles of Confederation. The Broadside states that the attendees voted unanimously to disapprove the nomination of James Madison for re-election by a caucus of members of Congress. Now, this argument is that there is nothing in the Constitution that provides for the nominations for president to come from Congress. Instead, the Constitution provides that candidacies are to come from the states. And so the argument is that the congressional caucus meeting and nominating a candidate for president is actually unconstitutional. It also disapproves of the nomination of Madison because of his rash request for a declaration of war before the country was ready. It states that the conduct of the war to date had been weak and calls for its, quote, speedy, honorable termination, end quote. Madison is accused of following a, quote, Southern policy which is hostile to commerce and discouraging to agriculture. Pennsylvania's two great resources, end quote. It calls out the fact that the presidents have been Virginians for 20 of 24 years of there being a presidency. It endorses the election of Dewitt Clinton and Pennsylvania Attorney General Jared Ingersoll for vice president. Now, I can't overemphasize how exceptional this broadside is. First, it explicitly is a promotion of Dewitt Clinton for the presidency of the United States. Prior to the political collector and American history scholars' discovery of the Dewitt Clinton broadside collection, no artifact involving Dewitt Clinton's campaign for president was known to exist except for references in newspapers published during the election. While we have now located pre-1820 broadsides in many locations, but no other Dewitt Clinton presidential broadside has been discovered except for those that are owned by the Institute. Now, the incredible importance of this broadside is a bit tempered by the fact that the Dewitt Clinton broadside collection includes 5 additional pro-Clinton for president broadsides, and the Institute's broadside and poster collection has another one. So all of the Dewitt Clinton broadsides in existence are owned by the Albany Institute. Our next broadside is also from Pennsylvania. It is addressed to the democratic adopted citizens of Irish birth, says countrymen and fellow citizens, and it's from October of 1812. Now, in these days, there was not complete consistency on voting date. The dates were different from state to state, and even within states for local reasons, dates fluctuated. So the presidential vote in the country went from Friday, October 30th, 1812, to Wednesday, December 2nd, 1812. This broadside from Philadelphia supports Clinton. It is directed to the voters of Irish birth and to their descendants. The author is listed as, quote, Montgomery, end quote, which is most likely a pseudonym. The broadside states that there are 3 candidates for president: Mr. Madison, Mr. Clinton, and Mr. King. Now, the reference to Mr. King is a reference to Rufus King, who was a Federalist United States Senator from New York, and in the early portion of 1812 was being promoted as the potential Federalist candidate, but he did not run. The Federalist did not endorse anyone. The broadside's text says that it's going to not comment on Madison because the author had previously supported Madison. It says it's going to pass over in complete silence King, and it goes on to defend Clinton from attacks that he should be rejected because he is being supported by Federalists. And it points out that Dewitt Clinton was the unanimous choice of the Democratic Republican State Legislative Caucus in New York. It then sets forth Clinton's long history of support for the Irish cause and Irish immigrants to the United States. It states that Clinton's election will result, quote, in immediate and honorable peace, end quote. The next broadside is another pro-Clinton broadside. It's titled Republican Meeting, and it states it's at a numerous and respectable meeting of the Republican citizens of Albany and Colony, friendly to the election of Honorable Dewitt Clinton to the presidency of the United States, convened by popular notice at the Columbian Hotel, November 6, 1812. The headline really says it all. Its content names both candidates, stating the campaign theme that President James Madison was nominated unconstitutionally by a portion of the members of Congress. It states that Clinton was nominated constitutionally by Republicans members of the New York State Legislature. It criticizes a recent meeting in Albany by persons, quote, styling themselves Republicans friendly to the re-election of James Madison as President of the United States. The broadside resolves that we entertain the most unbounded confidence in the talents and correct republicanism of Honorable Dewitt Clinton. It congratulates Solomon Southwick Esquire, the editor of the Albany Regency, for his support of Clinton for president. And it condemns the appointment of individuals, quote, by turbulent association of individuals in the city of New York who are now wandering the streets of Albany, attempting to defeat Clinton. It names a committee to combat, quote, the machinations of the cabal, end quote. 3 days later, in Albany, the New York members of the Electoral College would meet and they would all vote for President Clinton. And that brings us to our final broadside tonight. One more, because that's the duplicate of the Republican meeting. The final broadside is printed in Albany on November 9th of 1812. It reports. So I think we have another one there, Patrick, coming up.
I didn't have another one, Tom. That was the last one. No.
Oh my goodness. I'm sorry. Okay. Well, I'm just going to mention we're not going to see it, but there's one final broadside. It's dated November 8th, 1812. It's a report immediately the day of the meeting of the New York Electoral College, where it reports that they voted for Dewitt Clinton, and it lists the names of all the electors. It's a pretty simple broadside, but at the time it was made, it was still a very, very reasonable prospect that this New York governor, he wasn't governor at the time, but this New York political leader would be elected president of the United States. Over the next couple of months, the results from the various states started trickling in, and after a period of time, it became clear that Clinton had come close to defeating the incumbent president, but had not won. So for the next 4 years, a Virginian would occupy the presidency. And then for the next 8 years after that, another Virginian would occupy the presidency, that being James Monroe. In 1824, the presidency would go back to Massachusetts with the election of John Quincy Adams. And then a guy from Tennessee would get elected, Andrew Jackson, and serve 2 terms. And finally, in 1836, the Empire State would fill the presidency for the first time with a native who happened to be an Albanian by the name of Martin Van Buren, who was elected to the presidency of the United States. So thank you for participating this evening. Before we open it up to questions, I would again like to urge you, if you can, come to the Institute and see this wonderful program, Fellow Citizens, Dewitt Clinton Broadsides of the Early Republic. And while you're there, take a look at the rest of this unbelievably wonderful historic museum. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Tom. And I'm sorry about that. I didn't have that last one on my list, so I'm sorry I didn't.
No, my fault. My fault.
So thank you for your presentation. Very, very informative. So if anybody has any questions for Mr. Keefe, please feel free to type a question into the chat box, and we will be happy to have it answered for you. Were there any broadsides or other pieces of campaign material directly issued by candidates during this era?
No, no. Well, I mean, there's certainly a possibility that a candidate may have been behind the production, but the candidate, it was improper. The candidates weren't out there campaigning. The general gist of things is candidates were supposed to remain aloof from office. Now, I'm sure the candidates were out there campaigning to some degree, but that couldn't be a known thing. So while a candidate may have had responsibility for the production of a broadside, they wouldn't have let that known to the world. So all of these things are either issued anonymously or issued by committees. Almost all of the ones that are issued by committees have numerous names of the members of the committee. They will actually state that at this meeting a chairman was chosen and a secretary was chosen, and then very often a committee of correspondence, and the broadside will name the members of the committee of correspondence whose job it is to inform the newspapers and produce the broadsides that say what happened at the meeting.
When was the first introduction of official campaign materials like buttons, posters, ribbons, etc.?
Yeah, the earliest things like ribbons and buttons start with 1824, and then more so in 1828, and more so in 1832, and then more so in 1836, and then in 1840. An avalanche of incredible proportions. In 1840, the William Henry Harrison race against incumbent Martin Van Buren was the first could be called really a modern political campaign. Now, having said that, most of these things were not produced officially by campaign committees, and right on through today, most political items produced during campaigns are not produced by official campaign committees. And I'm not saying none were, but especially in the early days of the Republic, campaign committees, for the most part, did not produce these things. It was entrepreneurs in the early emerging industries, the producers of cloth, the glassmakers, the early photographers. It was capitalists produced these things to sell to the public, and as opposed to the campaigns actually producing these things.
What were some other uses of broadsides besides politics, and were they more prevalent in some places than others?
So here's, I think, a tremendous use of them, especially in the late 1700s, and then more and more in the early 1800s. A tremendous use in advertising, right? So the Institute has broadsides that are businesses in downtown Albany that have produced a broadside that announced that a shipment is expected to arrive in the harbor from England, bringing in various types of goods, sort of announcing that come next Tuesday, you can expect to come to the store and be able to get new cloth and new china and that kind of stuff. And so that very, very prevalent. Government proclamations, the various government institutions decided effective ways of communicating with the public were produce statements and proclamations and post them all over the place. What was the second part of that question?
Were they more prevalent in some places than others?
Okay, so I don't literally know an answer to that question, but I have to believe that yes, absolutely. And so first of all, they would be mostly in urban areas where there would be printers, right? I mean, you generally in small rural farming communities, you wouldn't have a print shop for the most part. But I'm sure that some urban areas had a greater use of broadsides than others, but I'm not actually a broadside expert.
That's fair enough. So that's the last question that has come through so far. If we have any other questions at this point, please feel free to go ahead and type them into the chat box.
So nobody asked me why I refer to Martin Van Buren as a native of Albany, right? I thought that would promote somebody to say, what are you talking about, Martin Van Buren being a native of Albany? But I give a Martin Van Buren talk, and Martin Van Buren, as you know, was born in Kinderhook, New York. But he left Kinderhook, New York at a pretty young age. He was elected at, I think, 21, 22 or 3 years old as a New York State Senator. And upon his election to New York State Senator, he effectively moved to the Capitol. Now, he was a prominent lawyer who was a litigation lawyer. He spent his life in court for a big portion of his early life. And so, Albany was a big city, and Albany was the capital of the state during all of his life. And there was easy transport between Albany and New York. So he went between Albany and New York, but he lived in Albany. His children were raised in Albany. His children went to Albany schools. His grandchildren were all born in Albany, right? He was elected United States Senator from New York. He was a citizen of Albany when he was elected. He was elected governor of the state of New York as a citizen of Albany. He was elected vice president of the United States as a citizen of Albany. He was elected president of the United States as a citizen of Albany. He was defeated for re-election as a citizen of Albany. Now, during his first term in office, and anticipating retirement after his second term, he bought an abandoned mansion in his hometown of Kinderhook, planning on rehabbing it to move there in 6 years after he left the presidency. He left the presidency before he thought he was going to leave the presidency, and he came back to Albany and then spent several years rehabbing this abandoned mansion and moving there and living a fairly long life back in Kinderhook, but he was really an Albanian.
Has there been any interest in your discoveries by other institutions and researchers?
Oh, absolutely. When this first hit, and the main way it really started to spread was the Albany Institute of History and Art was gracious enough to allow 25 of these broadsides come and be displayed and be part of a program at a convention here in the city of Albany of of collectors of political campaign material. And that program got wide, very, very wide publicity throughout the collectors community, but also throughout the academic community. And I will never forget one day getting a phone call from, and I apologize, I actually talked about this in my last talk, and I had this written down, and I forget the professor's name now, but I got a call from this Columbia, I think he's Columbia University professor. He is the leading scholar in the world on John Jay. He is the guy who edited the 17-volume John Jay papers over a period of a decade or more than a decade. And he had seen something somewhere about this collection and about the program we were going to have. And he called me up and he said, he introduced himself and he said, "Now, are you telling me that with your own eyes, you have seen a broadside that has to do with John Jay's election for governor of the state of New York?" And I just started laughing. And I said, "Well, yeah, but what I got to tell you is no, there's 7 of them. There are 7 broadsides that have to deal with." And he was like, "I can't believe it." He said, "I can't believe it." So he then made an arrangement to come and make a special visit to the Institute, so he himself in person could come and see these. I came in and met him, and he has written articles, and he's actually spoken. Within the past couple of months, he did one of these Zoom lectures about his field. But the answer is, this has now gotten out all over, and the academic community is aware, and the collection is being cataloged for the purposes of putting the catalog online so that institutions all over can know they exist, and all these institutions borrow from one another, right? So these things have never been borrowed in their 150-year history of being owned, because the world doesn't know they exist. I think in the future you will see these being loaned out and displayed potentially all over the world.
Rob Haberman is the
Thank you.
gentleman at Columbia, and yes, he did a talk in November, which you can find on the Albany Institute's YouTube page. Was the mayor of New York City appointed by the governor and state legislator? And if so, when did it become elected?
So the answer is yes. No, back in these days, back in the this era, no mayor, there was no election of mayors anywhere. This council of appointments was 4 state legislators, 2 assemblymen, 2 senators that were appointed by their bodies to the council of appointment. And all state hiring, if you were hiring a janitor for the Capitol, council of appointment did the hiring. Council of appointment appointed the attorney general, appointed the mayor of the city of New York. Appointed all the sheriffs in the state, and appointed all the judges in the state. Now the governor is an ex officio member of this appointments, and the governor had a vote if there was a tie. If the governor had a vote if there was a tie, but obviously a very powerful entity, and all these things were appointed by. And so when it changed, I'm sorry, I don't know. Probably pretty late in the process. I know by the 1860s, the mayors of New York were elected. So exactly when there was that changeover, and most of the stuff I know based on collecting political campaign material, there are no things for running for mayor of New York, I believe, from before the Civil War. So I'm not sure exactly when it changed, but it was pretty late in the process.
As a lawyer, didn't Van Buren travel to district courts in various jurisdictions like Hamilton, Burr, and others?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. Although He was very successful, so he became very wealthy, and at you know at some at when at by so he stopped practicing law as he basically became a completely consumed full-time politician. But he had been so successful, he was wealthy, and he devoted his time to politics. I'm not sure exactly when the changeover was. He was elected United States Senator in something like 1826, and then he was he in 1820, between 1824 and 1828. He created the National Democratic Party. He did what he did in the state of New York. In the state of New York, he created the New York State Democratic Party. After he became United States Senator, and after the 1824 election, where John Quincy Adams won the popular vote, and there was no result in the Electoral College, and then it was Congress that chose Adams for president over the guy that had won the election, Andrew Jackson. Martin Van Buren teamed up with Andrew Jackson. He actually went and spent a lot of time at the Hermitage and convinced Jackson to let him take over Jackson's political operation. And Martin Van Buren created the American Democratic Party, the oldest political party in the world today. And but from at least about 1826, 1828, he was just a full-time political guy for the rest of his life. Well, for the rest of his life until he was defeated.
Great. Well, that's the last question that came through. We are just about 10 minutes after 8 o'clock tonight, so I do want to be mindful of everyone's time this evening. So, Tom, thank you for your presentation tonight. It was very, very informative. Thank you, everybody. Yes, I see a couple of people who are giving you the virtual round of applause, so we can join in with that. I want to thank everybody who is able to join us this evening. Thank you, everyone, for your interest in the Albany Institute's programs. So I hope everybody enjoyed tonight's presentation. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their evening. And once again, Tom, thank you so much for your insights and your expertise. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Have a good night, everybody.